Welcome to American Spirits episode 19. I am back hosting after being out last week for an event that I attended with a few friends, quite a lot of friends actually. And this week we are starting a new arc on the show covering the Monroe Doctrine. So I'm joined as usual by co host Ryan Turnipseed. Hello, Ryan.
Hello, how are you doing?
Um, let's see. Yeah, it looks like I am coming through on stream. So my plan to fix my audio worked. I'm actually talking quite low, so I'll probably reduce my gain a little bit so I can stop whispering. But yeah, actually, I have a little bit of a cold from traveling, so I'm getting over it. Head's a bit stuffy, so it is what it is. Should be fine for the stream. And of course, we're joined by Mr. Auberon Quinn again. How are you doing?
I'm very well. Good evening, Charlemagne. Good evening, Ryan.
Very good. Yeah. So I lowered my audio a bit so I can kind of speak at a normal level. Let me know in chat if it's like too low or something. But we should be good now. Anyway, the Monroe Doctrine. So people don't know what it is, do they? Because everyone, it's like this thing people reference, the Monroe Doctrine. What does it means? What does it mean? It means like America can just like do whatever it wants or something in like this half of the world. Today we're actually going to read, well, we're not going to read the whole thing, but we're going to read from uh, President Monroe's farewell address, where he laid out what was called the Monroe Doctrine, and then several, we could say, reiterations or modifications to the doctrine. Now, this farewell address to Congress goes through quite a bit of current affairs for the time, as you would expect, and a little bit of what you might call geopolitics in current parlance. And then towards the end of the speech, the Monroe Doctrine is actually laid out. Now, Ryan, you were talking a little bit about some of the historical backdrop before we went on air. Would you like to lay out any background before we actually start talking about what the doctrine itself is?
Yeah, in fact, there's three things that I would like to really go over, only one of which I was mentioning before the stream, that I think the audience would need to know before we start reading from this. Number one, and perhaps the easiest to forget, is that when you read Monroe's address, or if you listen to us read it, you need to be very careful not to impute a later understanding onto Monroe. It's going to be very easy because, and this is why it's turned into the thing it is, it's very easy to do so, especially if you live in our world today. But Monroe said what he meant, and there's a lot omitted of what usually gets called the Monroe Doctrine today. So that's like the first important thing. The second important thing that I was talking about before we started is that there were some events in Europe by the time that this address was given. Most importantly, we're in a post-Napoleonic Europe. Spain and Portugal have basically lost their North American colonies. In fact, we were just establishing our diplomatic relations with the new independent republics. And in Europe, there was the Holy Alliance between Prussia, Austria, and Russia that was adamant on stamping out any leftover liberalism from the French Revolution, restoring the monarchies, and most importantly for the United States, restoring the colonies. And this was perhaps part ideological and part self-interested on the powers of the Holy Alliance, because obviously the monarchies that formed the Holy Alliance were clearly threatened by the existence of liberalism in Europe, and the course of history seems to have proven them correct. But also the existence of independent republics and former colonies that were under the control of absolute monarchies, basically Spain and Portugal, they feared would cause sort of like a domino effect, to use an anachronism. So the Holy Alliance had put down liberal rebellions recently in Spain and Portugal. They started making claims that they were wanting to restore the colonies to Spain and Portugal. So that's like the immediate cause of this doctrine being given. The third thing, and this is sort of tangential, but kind of provides a glimpse into American politics at the time, is that we do not intervene in Europe, and that's part of this doctrine. We'll get there. But that's not to say that we don't have interests that are ideological that many people at the time thought would be good if, say, one side prevailed in a conflict. The one that Monroe brings up that was basically a bipartisan support at the time is the Greek rebellion against the Ottomans. And this is because even though we're talking geopolitics, most of the founders and then the incoming second generation of politicians, your Clays, Calhouns, and Websters, and whomever else, they did have ideological convictions. So as you read this, it's not just pure power politics. There's a lot of hope, and if you read other people at the time, that a enlightened Christian Greece would defeat the Turk, and that the causes of enlightenment would be able to have hold. So it's not like America is entirely uninterested in Europe. We are just practically uninterested because we don't have a cause to intervene, and in fact found that to be against our interests. So that's like the three things I wanted to preface us with.
And of course, the other essential bit of context that the audience needs to understand Monroe's farewell address is the abominable state of transportation between Cumberland, Maryland, and Wheeling, West Virginia.
So, yes, if you actually try to read the whole address, you're going to be wondering what on earth am I reading for the first half, because this is an address to both chambers of Congress. We do get to talk about some internal developments and some roadways and whatever else, or at least Monroe does. I don't think we'll be reading any of that today. It's just funny to think that once upon a time, Congress's main topic of interest, such that it precedes any discussion of geopolitics, is the road system. Simpler times, perhaps. So, I think that's everything. Before we jump in, unless Charlie, you had anything.
No, only other bit is, there's some stuff in the beginning about the implementation of the Treaty of Ghent, which ended the War of 1812. But yes, I think we should get to the portion of the speech that one would call the Monroe Doctrine. Let me know if you want to back up. I'm going to start reading from where I would say the actual thing we know as the Monroe Doctrine starts.
On account of your illness, do you want me to start reading?
Oh no, I'm good. I'm just a bit stuffy.
Okay.
It doesn't hurt or anything. So, quote: "The citizens of the United States cherish sentiments the most friendly in favor of the liberty and happiness of their fellow men on that side of the Atlantic. In the wars of the European powers in matters relating to themselves, we have never taken any part, nor does it comport with our policy to do so." End quote. I'll just pause after each paragraph. So, just to reiterate, what he's saying there is, in the wars between, like it says, we do not interfere with whatever the Europeans are doing in their wars on their continent, although we wish them well. Continuing, quote: "It is only when our rights are invaded or seriously menaced that we resent injuries or make preparation for our defense. With the movements in this hemisphere, we are of necessity more immediately connected, and by causes which must be obvious to all enlightened and impartial observers." End quote. So again, the only time we're going to actually make move to war is when something seriously threatens us, particularly in this hemisphere.
Well, and not just that, he's very explicit, like our defense. So this is very important and something that will be reinterpreted. This is not a proactive doctrine.
That's a good observation, because in modern parlance, of course, defense is a euphemism for attacking everyone all the time whenever you feel like it. But in the 19th century, the word defense actually does mean defense.
Yes, yeah, and that's very important, because if defense here meant we can preemptively act in our defense, this very weird sort of contortion of the word, then our immediate foreign policy during this time would have been very different. We had more than enough opportunity to start interfering with these newly independent republics, yet we didn't really do that. We established diplomatic relations, trade, and whatever else, but we did not actually militarily intervene during this time. So defense just means defense here.
Now, continuing, and this part will be relevant for later interpretations of this doctrine. Quote: "The political system of the Allied powers is essentially different in this respect from that of America. This difference proceeds from that which exists in their respective governments, and to the defense of our own, which has been achieved by the loss of so much blood and treasure, and matured by the wisdom of their most enlightened citizens, and under which we have enjoyed unexampled felicity, this whole nation is devoted. End quote. The important bit there is this observation of the difference in type of government between Europe and the American continents. That is a republic versus monarchies, even absolute monarchies in many cases.
The most absolute monarchies, when he's talking about allies here, he's talking about the Holy Alliance,
Yes.
which was the reactionary alliance of the Tsar of Russia, the King of Prussia, and the Emperor of Austria-Hungary. These were the most conservative, to use slightly anachronistic terminology, reactionary powers in Europe who had an ideological commitment to seeing uh, liberalism stamped out, which at this time in history, the American government saw itself as being on the other side of that ideological debate.
Indeed,
Right,
as we referenced earlier.
and part of the implication here as well is that that difference in government necessarily changes the interest of those nations. This is something that you can see if you read, say, more Monroe or other people during this time. But there is an understanding implicit here that because we are this enlightened republic compared to the tyrannies in Europe, is kind of how they would be referred to, that we do not need to act in the same way as they do, and in fact, doing different things from them is in our interest. So this is sort of why this is included. It's not like Monroe has turned into an ideological crusader necessarily, though he does have the beliefs behind it. There is this idea, though, that the form of government changes what we consider our interest.
All right, now continuing. And by the way, if you hear me cough, I'm muting stream side, so you don't have to worry about it. Quote, "We owe it, therefore, to candor and to the amicable relations existing between the United States and those powers to declare that we should consider any attempt on their part to extend their system to any portion of this hemisphere as dangerous to our peace and safety. With the existing colonies or dependencies of any European power, we have not interfered and shall not interfere, but with the governments who have declared their independence and maintained it, and whose independence we have, on great consideration and on just principles, acknowledged, we could not view any interposition for the purpose of oppressing them, or controlling in any other manner their destiny by any European power, in any other light than as the manifestation of an unfriendly disposition toward the United States." End quote.
Yeah, so we're not looking here at a declaration of all European powers get out of the Western Hemisphere. Monroe clearly maintains that existing colonies and their existing relationships will not be interfered with, which were extensive at this time. Most of the West Indies were still under British and French control. There were still Spanish and Portuguese interests on the South American continent and in Central America. So this isn't a declaration of get out. This is a statement that where peoples have risen up and established their own governments and the United States has recognized them, the United States will view any action against them as action against itself.
And Canada, it's very difficult to not overstate the importance of Canada here, because up until this point it had been vague whether the United States had designs on Canada. But now what we're saying here is that we can actually tolerate European colonies. So this sort of cuts off that justification for potentially acquiring Canada. And this is also important, especially to outsiders, say post-colonialists in the 20th century, who interpreted this document as sort of a precursor to anti-colonialism. This paragraph that Charlie just read is the explicit refutation of that. So not only is this just saying we don't care if Europeans are over here, we just don't want them to reacquire their colonies. This is also not a condemnation of colonies at all. So, for instance, like the Viet Cong or the Northern Vietnamese government would make allusions to this document as being an anti-colonial document, when if you read it, that's simply not the case. So, it's
Correct.
important there.
But if any of those colonies do secure their independence, as the United States did, and the United States recognizes it, then that will not be allowed to be undone. The American government would not tolerate the Europeans acting in a counter-revolutionary fashion, which is, of course, exactly what the Holy Alliance was doing in Europe and would like to achieve in the American hemisphere. Now, continuing. Quote, in the war between those new governments and Spain, we declared our neutrality at the time of their recognition, and to this we have adhered, and shall continue to adhere, provided no change shall occur, which, in the judgment of the competent authorities of this government, shall make a corresponding change on the part of the United States indispensable to their security. The late events in Spain and Portugal shew that Europe is still unsettled. Of this important fact, no stronger proof can be adduced than that the Allied powers should have thought it proper, on any principle satisfactory to themselves, to have interposed by force in the internal concerns of Spain. To what extent such interposition may be carried on the same principle is a question in which all independent powers whose governments differ from theirs are interested, even those most remote, and surely none more so than the United States. Our policy in regard to Europe, which was adopted at an early stage of the wars which have so long agitated that quarter of the globe, nevertheless remain the same, which is not to interfere in the internal concerns of any of its powers, to consider the government de facto as the legitimate government for us, and cultivate friendly relations with it, and to preserve those relations by a frank, firm, and manly policy, meeting in all instances the just claims of every power, submitting to injuries from none. End quote. I'll pause right there. I'll let you in a second. Just to note that the U.S. will consider any European government that exists and governs the country as the de facto legitimate government, and won't make designs upon altering that government to a form that it would like. And this includes everything from the absolutist Tsar of Russia to the absolute Parliament under the King of England or the Republic of France. But you go ahead, Ryan.
This is also important as well, because it's also implying that we didn't breach this, say, if we traded or recognized Napoleonic France while the other powers acknowledged an exiled monarchical government. So this is actually an even stronger claim. It's not just saying that we're not going to alter the government, but also we don't really care if there is a popularly considered legitimate government. We don't have any obligation to back them or exclusively trade with them because of their legitimacy. We only care about the de facto current ruling government.
So at the time Monroe was making this speech, I think there were 3 pretenders to the French throne, aside from the de facto government of France. So this is actually a really important point to make. Monroe was articulating that the policy of the United States is whoever is actually physically in charge is who the United States will treat as the government, without attempting to impose a regime better to its liking.
And interestingly enough, this went entirely out the window during World War II, where we explicitly tried to prop up a government that we considered to be legitimate, but not de facto according to existing treaties, due to wartime concerns. So this is I think this is a fascinating instance where no one talks about this really in the Monroe Doctrine, and especially post World War II. But any idea that the United States must support like the U.S. aligned government in Europe, Africa, Asia, or wherever else, like part of the Monroe Doctrine specifically says we don't care about that. We shouldn't care about that. We just keep going with whoever the de facto ruler is.
Yes, I mean, this is an enormous. Well, we've departed enormously in America from this policy now, where absolutely it is not the case that whatever government de facto exists will be recognized as legitimate. So we've majorly departed from the Monroe Doctrine. And this is interesting because people normally only think about the Monroe Doctrine in terms of, like I said, this idea that America just gets to dominate this half of the world. But it also applies, it also sets an attitude which we should have towards Europe and presumably the rest of the world. That is also part of the Monroe Doctrine.
Yeah, and as we have radically departed from this original formulation of the Monroe Doctrine, as we proceed to the stream, we will trace each of the steps by which we moved further and further away from this original conception of the doctrine.
Just so. So I will read one more paragraph, and then if you guys want to read any more, feel free, but I only have the next one highlighted. Quote, but in regard to those continents, circumstances are eminently and conspicuously different. It is impossible that the Allied powers should extend their political system to any portion of either continent without endangering our peace and happiness, nor can anyone believe that our southern brethren, if left to themselves, would adopt it of their own accord. It is equally impossible, therefore, that we should behold such interposition in any form with indifference. If we look to the comparative strength and resources of Spain and those new governments, and their distance from each other, it must be obvious that she can never subdue them. It is still the true policy of the United States to leave the parties to themselves in the hope that other powers will pursue the same course. End quote.
So the reasoning here is actually profoundly similar to the isolationist arguments on the U.S. side of things. If you look at the reasoning being applied here, Monroe is considering the second and third order effects. If the Holy Alliance tries to reimpose the Spanish and Portuguese colonial rule, it's going to cause massive turmoil here, where we've been trading with the de facto independent governments, and it's also likely that it would just directly involve us at a later point in time, because it's impossible for them to subdue these people, which is, to begin with, why they threw off colonial rule. So if you listen to any U.S. isolationist argument, it's very similar, just applied to the U.S. We don't have the will or ability to subdue a people however far away from us, nor should we be over there. And if we keep intervening there, it will eventually come back to us. This is extremely familiar, and this is where the reasoning sort of originates, at least in popular form, is here with Monroe.
Yeah, and before we move on to see how things change, let's look at an example of how they stay the same. Before Monroe, earlier in the speech, before he gets to articulating the Monroe Doctrine, he talks extensively about U.S. naval operations against Cuba and Puerto Rico that were going on at just this time. This is the time when Cuba and Puerto Rico were still under Spanish control, but apparently they had an outsized piracy problem where pirates would base themselves in Cuba and Puerto Rico and raid American shipping. And Monroe defends the naval expenditures necessary to go to Cuba and to Puerto Rico and burn shit down and solve this problem. This is something that's going to rear its head again when we look at Teddy Roosevelt's take on the Monroe Doctrine and on the Cold War history. Even now, at this very early stage, even with Monroe articulating this very limited and humble version of the doctrine, the U.S. is still acting in its own interests with muscular military force against European territories.
Right. And also, before we move on as well, there's another section that's going to crop back up because it's included in Monroe's speech, but it's only after he sort of changes the topic. And this will be capitalized upon by especially James K. Polk, who we're about to move to, who will very explicitly reinterpret the doctrine. But there's one more paragraph where Monroe sort of reflects on the growth and the strengthening of the country, how it grew from 3 million people to 10 million people, and as he notes, without really much immigration, so it's a native increase. And Monroe adds, sort of perilously, as we'll get to, at the first epoch, half the territory within our acknowledged limits was uninhabited and a wilderness. Since then, new territory has been acquired of vast extent, comprising within it many rivers, particularly the Mississippi, the navigation of which to the ocean was of the highest importance to the original states. Over this territory, our population has expanded in every direction, and new states have been established almost equal in number to those which formed the first bond of our union. This expansion of our population and accession of new states to our union have had the happiest effect on all its interests. So I think it's very clear, if you read the entire address from Monroe, that this is him just reflecting on the progress of the country, and he goes on to elaborate upon these points. But later interpreters of this doctrine will take this to mean that wherever the United States expands, or wherever settlers from the United States expand, that is now our territory and our interest, and therefore the United States has the ability to defend that in line with Monroe's doctrine. Even though, if you read this once again, the topic has very clearly changed by this point. So it's very unfortunate that this was included here. It makes sense if this is just an address to both chambers of Congress. But this is going to be capitalized upon by later politicians.
Right, of course. This is a farewell address by an outgoing president. Monroe could hardly have expected, I think, that the particular order of paragraphs and language he used would have such a profound effect on American foreign policy and be misinterpreted, perhaps intentionally in some cases. How many years later? 150, something like that, into the 21st century. So yes. Would you like to take the James K. Polk section? Give me a break from the reading.
Yes, yes. So
Excellent.
in 1845, so like a couple of decades later, James K. Polk had won with pretty convincing confidence an election. He won on a platform that may sound very strange to modern ears. He was very much against Henry Clay's American system, establishing a national bank. He was extremely liberal in his economics. He reoriented the Democratic Party to be in favor of the 48 revolutions in Europe when they began to happen in late 47. But he was also very expansionist. And this is where he's going to be very important for the Monroe Doctrine being reinterpreted. He was very expansionist westward for the United States. He is renowned for threatening war with all of our immediate neighbors during his time in office and getting territorial concessions from at least two of the most major ones. And also, or rather, but this must also be taken into account that he was very ideological in this regard, and that even if you are a fan of United States expansionism to the Pacific, you still should probably interpret this according to Polk's own ideology, which, as he declares and the Democratic Party declared in their own platform at the time, was extremely liberal. So this is from a address, and I don't have it actually in here. This should be an address to Congress. In 1845, towards the end of the year, and he has a whole bunch of things in here because it's he's discussing the state of the country at the end of 1845. So I'll just start in the parts relevant, where Polk says, "The recommendations which I have made as to the best manner of securing our rights in Oregon are submitted to Congress with great deference. Should they, in their wisdom, devise any other mode better calculated to accomplish the same object, it shall meet with my hearty concurrence." So this is important. What Polk is about to tell us and prescribe to us, he is doing so because he finds it to be most pragmatic towards expansion. Polk was very, like I've said already, Polk was very positive towards the idea of U.S. expansion, but he was also pragmatic about it. This was not something that was supposed to be the end or the purpose of the country. This is just something that he would like to be done pragmatically. And he'll go on as well to say that the Oregon Territory is of great interest to the United States national honor and the national interest. So we've already sort of stepped past the purpose of the Monroe Doctrine, which was very much about our own defense, security, peace, and prosperity. Now we're talking about the national honor and the national interest. And this is where Polk really starts to delve into the geopolitics, where he says, "Oregon is a part of the North American continent to which it is confidently affirmed the title of the United States is the best now in existence. For the grounds on which that title rests, I refer you to the correspondence of the late and present Secretary of State with the British plenipotentiary during the negotiation. The British proposition of compromise, which would make the Columbia the line south of 49 degrees, with a trifling addition of detached territory to the United States north of that river, and would leave on the British side 2/3 of the whole Oregon Territory, including the free navigation of the Columbia and all the valuable harbors on the Pacific, can never for a moment be entertained by the United States without an abandonment of their just and clear territorial rights, their own self-respect, and the national honor." So I'll just pause there. The reason that Polk is bringing up this to begin with is because there's an idea that the United States has a clear and obvious territorial right to what Polk wanted at least is now British Columbia in Canada. And this is what's going to sort of activate his appeals to the Monroe Doctrine. This is our territory, we just don't have it yet, and therefore we must defend it for the reasons that we previously outlined, which are different than what Monroe was talking about.
Ryan, I don't think you understand that the self-esteem of the United States in 1845 was very fragile, and any affront to our national honor would have been an existential threat.
I mean, this is funny because I really would like to attack it, but I'm sure many people listening in will find this convincing. But national honor, I think, as was proven by at least the early 20th century's geopolitics, is a very dangerous appeal to make for long-term foreign policy. It usually, in fact, involves many people dying, perhaps irreversibly wrecking your country.
And of course, what we're doing here is not putting forth an argument that Monroe was right and Polk was wrong. We are tracking historically the way the doctrine changes over time, and this is quite a monumental change from the self-interested support of independent nations in the Western Hemisphere against European predation. Now has become a justification for direct conflict with a direct territorial conflict with a European power, not in the aid of some other threatened republic, but in the direct interest of the United States.
Right. And I'll continue here because it's going to be more explicit. Polk continues, the rapid extension of our settlements over our territories heretofore unoccupied, the addition of new states to our confederacy, the expansion of free principles, and our rising greatness as a nation are attracting the attention of the powers of Europe. And lately the doctrine has been broached in some of them of a balance of power on this continent to check our advancement.
And let me just jump right in there on that
Yes.
balance of power. This is, of course, the height of Metternich's post-Napoleonic War settlement in Europe, where European statesmen for about 80 years were obsessed with maintaining a balance of power between the various great states of Europe, Russia, Austria-Hungary, Prussia, France, and Britain. And what Monroe is attacking here is the transfer of this idea of maintaining a balance of power on the American continent, just as the Europeans have been obsessed with maintaining a balance of power on the European continent.
Now, I should append there, yes, Metternich, the Austrian, but this concept of the balance of power is actually very much a British geostrategic move in order to balance and order Europe in so that a hegemonic land power does not form against Britain's naval hegemony. This is one of their main motivations for attacking Napoleon until he was defeated twice. And I'm reading a book on this right now, off and on, in the time I have, called No More Napoleons. So this balance of power is actually quite prescient for Polk to be extremely wary of that, because it actually comes less from Europe and more from our oldest enemy, the British Empire. So just wanted to make that point so we have a better idea of what this balance of power is. It's something that is kind of done to Europe, against Europe, by the British, sometimes with the cooperation of Europeans, yes. But Polk will be seeing how that's been playing out for the Europeans since the Napoleonic Wars, and certainly want no part in those sorts of manipulations.
Yes, that's a very good point. It is primarily aimed at Great Britain.
And something else to point out here as well is that Polk is almost directly quoting Monroe here, talking about the rapid extension of our people across unoccupied territories, the accession of new states to our confederacy, different language than Monroe used, where he called the Union. But this is why I point out that sort of tragic paragraph, is because this is Polk's whole claim to legitimacy here, to invoke it. He's quoting the doctrine. It just may or may not actually.
Well, he's quoting the speech, but he's quoting a part of the speech which does not contain the doctrine.
Right. Well, this is the reason I framed it that way, is because this is why people will sometimes include it in the doctrine, even though, and this is my interpretation, I don't think it's included. But I'll continue here. We'll see where he goes. The United States, sincerely desirous of preserving relations of good understanding with all nations, cannot in silence permit any European interference on the North American continent, and should any such interference be attempted, will be ready to resist it at any and all hazards. So we have upgraded the doctrine here from the European powers, especially the Holy Alliance, will not reimpose Spanish and Portuguese colonial rule on on newly independent republics, to no European interference in North America. This is a very extreme sort of extension that Monroe, if you remembered what we just read, did not actually say.
And it's an extension not just of what the United States is opposing in the doctrine, but it's also an extension of what the United States will do in opposition. Monroe was very circumspect about, oh, well, we'll have to consider any such impositions as being adversarial to the United States, but he never threatens to oppose it with force. Here, Polk is saying we're ready to go. We'll do whatever we have to stop you.
Now, of course, to be, I guess, fairer to Polk, when Monroe first proclaimed this doctrine that we ended up calling the Monroe Doctrine, the United States was in no position to make good on any such threats. It did not have the naval power. It barely had, I think it had like 8 frigates or something in its navy. I don't remember the exact number, but a very small navy by comparison to the the huge naval power we are now, or would later become even towards the end of the 19th century. So
Well,
perhaps we what I'm saying is we can't really know what Monroe would have said otherwise. A Monroe in a United States that did have a substantial navy capable of enacting American policy violently upon the Europeans in this hemisphere. We don't really know what that counterfactual would have looked like.
well, remember this comment here, because it's going to become very relevant to the refutation of what Polk is saying here by a member of Monroe's government. This will be very relevant, but hold that thought. We'll get there in just a moment. So Polk will continue here. It is well known to the American people and to all nations that this government has never interfered with the relations subsisting between other governments. We have never made ourselves parties to their wars or their alliances. We have not sought their territories by conquest. We have not mingled with parties in their domestic struggles, and believing our own form of government to be the best, we have never attempted to propagate it by intrigues, by diplomacy, or by force. We may claim on this continent a like exemption from European interferences. The nations of America are equally sovereign and independent with those of Europe. They possess the same rights, independent of all foreign interposition, to make war, to conclude peace, and to regulate their internal affairs. The people of the United States cannot, therefore, view with indifference attempts of European powers to interfere with the independent action of the nations on this continent. So this is actually, clearly this is in the interest of expanding the United States across North America, but the justification is still limiting. So this is not Monroe, to be clear. We've evolved. But Polk still does put a very clear limiting principle on this. The United States does not intervene in Europe in any way whatsoever, basically. Save maybe for trades. I think the Embargo Act might be considered that, but that wasn't what Polk was talking about. He listed out what he was. We do not interfere with Europe. We do not try to expand our form of government to other places in the world, and therefore, it's only fair that we have the right to North America. That's a very limiting principle that we have not abided by. So, just something to point out there, that even with this very expansionistic idea of the Monroe Doctrine that Polk is putting forward here, it's still so limited that we have grossly just blown past it in recent times.
And it's hard to really argue that a European power has more right to Oregon or British Columbia than the United States does, exempting Canada from that equation. So even Polk's version is still limited. It's still based on a sort of mutual understanding that you have your continent, we have ours. I think we could say Polk's version is at least fair if it is more expansionist than Monroe's.
Right, yeah, and that's the point here. Like, I have my own thoughts about Polk, mostly positive on balance, but regardless of your opinions, this is not what Monroe said. It's an evolution of it, but it is still very limited compared to the objective reality of the past 40 years of American history. So Polk is going to continue in a very similar but different interpretation of what Monroe was saying. He says, the American system of government is entirely different from that of Europe. Jealousy among the different sovereigns of Europe, lest any one of them might become too powerful for the rest, has caused them anxiously to desire the establishment of what they term the balance of power. It cannot be permitted to have any application on the North American continent, and especially to the United States. We must ever maintain the principle that the people of this continent alone have the right to decide their destiny. Should any portion of them, constituting an independent state, propose to unite themselves with our Confederacy, this will be a question for them and us to determine without any foreign interposition. We can never consent that European powers shall interfere to prevent such a union, because it might disturb the balance of power, which they may desire to maintain upon this continent. So he's stepping away from Oregon here and talking about the ideas of Mexican states seceding to join the Union, like, say, Texas, because France and Britain were pretty explicit that they were hesitant about Texas joining America. Polk is using the same principle as Monroe. The American system of government is different from that of Europe, therefore their interests should be different. But he's using that here to oppose the balance of power, which it wasn't as popular when Monroe was speaking. It existed, but it wasn't as mimetic, perhaps, as when Polk is speaking. So this is being applied to Texas now. With that, and he's about to quote the Monroe Doctrine, he continues, near a quarter of a century ago, the principle was distinctly announced to the world in the annual message of one of my predecessors that, quote, the American continents, by the free and independent condition which they have assumed and maintain, are henceforth not to be considered as subjects for future colonization by any European powers. This principle will apply with greatly increased force should any European power attempt to establish any new colony in North America. In the existing circumstances of the world, the present is deemed a proper occasion to reiterate and affirm the principle avowed by Mr. Monroe, and to state my cordial concurrence in its wisdom and sound policy. The reassertion of this principle, especially in reference to North America, is at this day but the promulgation of a policy which no European power should cherish the disposition to resist. Existing rights of every European nation should be respected, but it is due alike to our safety and our interests that the efficient protection of our laws should be extended over our whole territorial limits, and that it should be distinctly announced to the world as our settled policy that no future European colony or dominion shall with our consent be planted or established on any part of the North American continent. So this is where Polk pretty explicitly affirms that the Monroe Doctrine has force behind it as opposed to just diplomatic protest, and that this applies to our interest as well as to just any European colony being newly established. And that's where the quote ends. Polk is done here, I should say. Anything that we haven't pointed out here with Polk already?
Just a melancholy observation that we used to have statesmen who could write things like this themselves and express their own policies rather than being ciphers for whatever interests were behind them.
It is depressing.
Well, shall we move on to the great American statesman John C. Calhoun? At this point, are we ready?
Yes. So this would be about a month later. Lewis Cass of Michigan, who would run for president as Polk's successor, submitted a resolution. I believe this would be to the Senate, basically giving I don't want to say eternal, but a very committed stance of the United States on foreign affairs. Basically, it was to enshrine what Polk had just said into a resolution passed by the Senate. Mr. Calhoun, John C. Calhoun, was in Monroe's cabinet. He was the Secretary of War. If there was anyone to know if Monroe had any military intention behind the Monroe Doctrine, or would have any special insight as to what Monroe was meaning, it would be John C. Calhoun. And Calhoun explains his reasoning very methodically, and he's also a little bit more down to earth, at least in his language. So, Mr. Calhoun speaking.
I'll read Mr. Cass's part for you. We can play act.
Sure.
The congressional record.
So Mr. Calhoun speaking. We all remember the Holy Alliance to overthrow Bonaparte. England refused to join it, although she acted with it. In the process of time, the Holy Alliance contemplated an interference with the affairs of South America in order to restore in order to restore the dominion of Spain over her revolted provinces. Our government received an intimation from Mr. Canning, who was then at the head of the British ministry, a man of extraordinary sagacity and talent, stating at the time that if the American government would back the British government, she would discountenance such interference. And this general declaration had reference to a specific case and stopped there. Mr. Monroe was a wise man and had no design of burdening the country with a task which it could not perform. He knew there was a broader declaration made by the gentleman then Secretary of State. As far as my knowledge extends, it was never brought forward for cabinet deliberation. It has been a long time since, and I will not be positive. I have no doubt that the gentleman to whom reference has been made is entitled to the paternity. I say so because out of this grew the Panama Convention, although it was not legitimately an offspring. But if this declaration was right, the Panama Convention was no bad conception, and the propriety of our sending a minister could hardly be resisted. It was a more sensible form of carrying out a broad proposition. But, Mr. President, you and all the older senators know what would have been the result if, when we were called on, we had said we would join Great Britain against the rest of the world. We would have been speedily called on to act. I did, when the proposition first came up, give my assent to it, but after reflection, thought that it had a pernicious effect elsewhere, and would have it now. I made no opposition to this in consequence of a deference to Great Britain or the other European powers, but a deference to ourselves. Our own good sense should teach us that we ought not to undertake what we cannot perform. It should be so with individuals and with nations. By the adoption of the principle of the resolution, we would be called on to interfere whenever a European nation, right or wrong, should bring on a conflict of arms between one or another on this continent. I would ask the senator from Michigan, where is the limitation?
All right, and now Mr. Cass speaking. Will the gentleman allow me to explain the principle for which I contend is this? By such a declaration as that contemplated in the resolution, we would merely place our protest on record, not being thereby bound to any definite course of action, but being left free to maintain neutrality or actively engage in enforcing the principle as we might see fit.
And this is Mr. Calhoun responding. Well, would it not be better to wait for the emergency in which we would have sufficient interest to interfere and sufficient power to make that interference influential? Why make any such declaration now? What good purpose can it serve? Only to show to the men that are to come after us that we were wiser and more patriotic than we feared they might be. I cannot, for my life, see a single good likely to result from this measure. Will mere vaporing bravado have any practical effect? No. You must adopt a very different course of policy. You must arm, equip, fit out your navies, raise a powerful revenue, and resist them by practical measures, if you think proper to resist them. Will not the effect of such a declaration be the very reverse of all this practical course of policy? Will it not create jealousy on the part of England? Will it not militate against the formation of alliances on the part of nations favorably disposed toward us? No good effect can come from it. From first to last, in my opinion, it will be followed by unqualified evil consequences. In this spirit, I resisted it on a former occasion. In this spirit, I resist it now. As to Texas, Mr. President, as far as I had any share in the management of that particular question, I can only say that the declaration of Mr. Monroe had not the weight of that piece of paper. And if 1,000 such declarations in even stronger terms had been made and passed the Senate, they would not have had that weight. Declarations, sir, are easily made. The affairs of nations are not controlled by mere declarations. If a declaration of opinion were sufficient to change the whole course of events, no nation would be more prompt than we. But we must meet interference in our affairs in another way. We must meet it as it was met in the case of Texas, decidedly, boldly, and practically. We must meet each particular case by itself and according to its own merits. always taking care not to assert our rights until we feel ourselves able to sustain our assertions. As to general abstract declarations of that kind, I would not give a farthing for 1,000 of them. They do more harm than good, or rather no good at all, but a great deal of harm. So that's John C. Calhoun's sort of correction of Polk and Cass regarding Monroe's doctrine. That's his insight.
Yeah, so I think we clearly see some of his backcountry practicality there. I mean, his whole point, summarizing, is basically let's not commit ourselves to any permanent policy, and certainly not to something that would necessitate the building up of military power in order to enforce it or to provoke any reactions against it. We should just handle things case by case, very deliberately, and based on the merits of that particular case, rather than laying out these broad principles by which the United States will deal with the European powers.
Well, and also very importantly, he does lay out a broad principle for dealing with the European powers, and that is declaring these very massive doctrines applying to the whole rest of the world is a very bad course of action. So so this is sort of a, at the time, refutation of Polk that the interest in expansion should not be tied to this doctrine, because if you take out that and you just have the original doctrine, Monroe is just saying that we will view this in such terms that we'll view recolonization as very hostile towards us, but not that we'll meet it with force. Calhoun here is saying that if we attach force to a broad principle and apply it to the rest of the world, it will just create hostility to which we will have to use that force. So this is very sophisticated, despite the perhaps plainer language of Calhoun compared to Polk. And I think this is one of the first times in American history, certainly one of the more important, where he's saying that broad declarations of American foreign policy, just as declarations, can have ill effects for America, regardless of what we do immediately after we declare it. So it's a very important refutation.
That isn't very make the world safe for democracy.
Well,
no, it's not.
I'm glad you used that particular phrase. One of us had to use it eventually. So we're actually quite we're quite well on our way there at this point. Let's move on to Richard Olney. He was the Secretary of State under Grover Cleveland, and he also reinterpreted, modernized, let's say, the Monroe Doctrine towards the end of the 19th century. I'm actually not sure what the context of this particular speech is. Do you know where the speech came from?
Yes. So at this point in time, this is after the Civil War. The United States has, if I remember correctly, we were either just finishing it or having passed it. I can't remember the exact year. I think this was in the 1890s, so we were long past Reconstruction, but I could be misremembering. And Great Britain and the Republic of Venezuela had a border dispute. Great Britain at the time controlled British Guyana. The Republic of Venezuela, as it does today, claimed part of that land. And usually to this point in time, if a European power and an independent republic had a territorial dispute, the United States did not consider that colonization and intervene, because part of the original Monroe Doctrine was that the republics of the continent had the right to independently conduct their own diplomacy. This is where it changes. Richard Olney is about to explain to us that actually, if there's a border dispute between Europe and a North American power, or a North American republic, or a South American, the United States has the obligation to arbitrate that dispute, because this could possibly be a ploy to recolonize the continents. So that is, the United States actually gets to declare when independent republics in America get to exercise their diplomacy independently. I mean, we get to solve border disputes now. We get to decide where land goes.
Right, and he's referencing the dispute with Venezuela, so it's toward the very end of the 19th century, around like 1895, 97, something like that. So I'll select a paragraph from the speech that references the Monroe Doctrine. Quote, that America is in no part open to colonization, though the proposition was not universally admitted at the time of its first enunciation, has long been universally conceded. We are now concerned, therefore, only with that other practical application of the Monroe Doctrine, the disregard of which by a European power is to be deemed an act of unfriendliness towards the United States. The precise scope and limitations of this rule cannot be too clearly apprehended. It does not establish any general protectorate by the United States over other American states. It does not relieve any American state from its obligation as fixed by international law, nor prevent any European power directly interested from enforcing such obligations or from inflicting merited punishment for the breach of them. It does not contemplate any interference in the internal affairs of any American state or in the relations between it and other American states. It does not justify any attempt on our part to change the established form of government of any American state or to prevent the people of such state from altering that form according to their own will and pleasure. The rule in question has but a single purpose and object. It is that no European power or combination of European powers shall forcibly deprive an American state of the right and power of self-government and of shaping for itself its own political fortunes and destinies. End quote. So that that segment's a fairly, I think, uncontentious restatement of the Monroe Doctrine itself. Would you say he's slipped in anything there that is out of line with the original Monroe Doctrine?
I will say earlier in this speech, he conceded Polk's reinterpretation. He includes the interest of the nation and our prosperity and peace as the reasons for the doctrine. So, but in this, no, and in fact, he is extremely limiting. Which once again, you can tell by United States history, this was not followed. Almost a few decades after Olney gave this speech, it was completely violated by multiple administrations. But this is where he's putting the boundaries on the doctrine again. We do not get to just willy-nilly interfere, change governments in the hemisphere. We don't get to establish protectorates or whatever else. This is just, we are trying to make sure that European powers do not encroach upon territories, which, as I said, if you just give a plain reading to the original doctrine, it's contradictory. We're interfering on the American Republic's right to their independent diplomacy. But at least Olney is giving very strict boundaries on how he's applying it. We get to arbitrate boundary disputes, but no further. So, it's a reinterpretation, but it's also remarkable due to the boundaries he's placing on this.
Now, I'll read a little bit more from it. The two more paragraphs. This one begins with an ellipsis, so there's a bit preceding this, but quote, Europe as a whole is monarchical, and with the single important exception of the Republic of France, is committed to the monarchical principle. America, on the other hand, is devoted to the exactly opposite principle, to the idea that every people has an inalienable right of self-government, and, in the United States of America, has furnished to the world the most conspicuous and conclusive example of proof of the excellence of free institutions, whether from the standpoint of national greatness or of individual happiness. It cannot be necessary, however, to enlarge upon this phase of the subject, whether moral or material interests be considered. It cannot be universally conceded that those of Europe are irreconcilably diverse from those of America, and that any European control of the latter is necessarily both incongruous and injurious. If, however, for the reasons stated, the forcible intrusion of European powers into American politics is to be deprecated, if, as it is to be deprecated, it should be resisted and prevented, such resistance and prevention must come from the United States. They would come from it, of course, were it made the point of attack, but if they come at all, they must also come from it when any other American state is attacked, since only the United States has the strength adequate to the exigency. Is it true, then, that the safety and welfare of the United States are so concerned with the maintenance of the independence of every American state as against any European power as to justify and require the interposition of the United States whenever that independence is endangered? The question can be candidly answered in but one way. The states of America, South as well as North, by geographical proximity, by natural sympathy, by similarity of governmental constitutions, are friends and allies, commercially and politically, of the United States. To allow the subjugation of any of them by a European power is, of course, to completely reverse that situation and signifies the loss of all advantages incident to their natural relations to us. But that is not all. The people of the United States have a vital interest in the cause of popular self government. They have secured the right for themselves and their posterity at the cost of infinite blood and treasure. They have realized and exemplified its beneficent operation by a career unexampled in point of national greatness or individual felicity. They believe it to be for the healing of all nations, and that civilization must either advance or retrograde according as its supremacy is extended or curtailed. Imbued with these sentiments, the people of the United States might not impossibly be wrought up to an active propaganda in favor of a cause so highly valued both for themselves and for mankind. But the age of the Crusades is past, and they are content with such assertion and defense of the right of popular self government as their own security and welfare demand. It is in that view, more than any other, that they believe it not to be tolerated that the political control of an American state shall be forcibly assumed by a European power. End quote.
Okay, that's getting a little more safe, make the world safe for democracy. Yeah, so it's fascinating what he's doing here. He is conflating the progress of civilization with the prosperity of the American system. As the United States and its system of government grows across the world, civilization itself will advance. And as the United States contracts, civilization itself must go into retrograde. And therefore, it might not be impossible to ring up a war fervor in the United States to protect the self-government of the American states.
Something else that's very interesting here, I think, with what he's talking about, he is reiterating very strongly this thing that Calhoun was arguing against, that the United States must meet like an explicit reestablishment of European government in the hemisphere with force. So Calhoun, in terms of what's happening, lost the argument. His policy has never been applied, especially since the end of the Civil War. And we do have general resolutions on foreign policy to be met with force and treasure. But beyond that as well, something that I would like to point out here is that a lot of people, especially on our side, will invoke the Monroe Doctrine when they see foreign influence in American states. But as you can see through the entire time that we have read on the Monroe Doctrine, at least up until this point in 1895, foreign influence in American states is not that objectionable. And in fact, it's kind of expected that when these states conduct their own trade and diplomacy, they will naturally gravitate towards multiple countries that are not the United States, though probably also with us. We are only, even in these make the world safe for democracy-ish interpretations as we get closer to that era, even now, we're only concerned if there's like an explicit takeover of a state, not just influence, this ethereal idea of influence. So that was something I wanted to point out here.
Yeah, that's really important. Even at this point, we're still only talking about a state's government being overthrown and replaced with a European colonial rule. But yeah, that paragraph was particularly interesting because now we have words intruding, like we're talking about all of mankind. This idea has been reiterated a few times, but you can kind of see it being developed further. This idea that one of the concerns is the fact that this similarity in government, the fact that these other states to our south are republics and not ruled by absolute monarchies, that is actually a strategic advantage. And this is this exact same idea you see in the 21st century, this idea that we need to make the world safe for democracy because it is to the United States' advantage if ever the other power is also democratic and has our same form of government. Their war might come, if dictators or other forms of government that are more authoritarian might exist. So even in the 19th century, we are actually seeing that same sort of idea, the germ of where that idea would ultimately go, growing right here. So it's quite an old idea, and it is very distinct from the original Monroe Doctrine, although the seeds of it were there, which is interesting.
Did you have any more to read?
No. Would you like to?
I've got a short passage I'd like to add just to put an exclamation point on this. Today, the United States is practically sovereign on this continent, and its fiat is law upon the subjects to which it confines its interposition. Why? It is not because of pure friendship or goodwill felt for it. It's simply not by reason of its high it is not simply by reason of its high character as a civilized state, nor because wisdom and justice and equity are the invariable characteristics of the dealings of the United States. It is because, in addition to all other grounds, its infinite resources combined with its isolated position render it master of the situation and practically invulnerable as against any or other powers. And so here you have the beginnings of this idea that the United States is the indispensable nation. By virtue of its inherent strength, it can do the things which need to be done, which no one else can, and thereby a responsibility to do the things which need to be done, which no one else can, falls upon our shoulders.
Interestingly, though, and I find this fascinating, he attributes this also to our isolation, not necessarily foreign policy, but just in terms of geographic position.
Yes,
Um,
exactly.
but as we expand throughout the world, we don't become isolated anymore. So that is where he is very clearly going with it. That's where this doctrine will be interpreted later, is to argue for some sort of expansion of U.S. hard power. But even in their justifications, as we do that, we grow less powerful and more overextended. I find that remarkably honest, even if perhaps accidental.
I suspect the latter.
Yeah, right. The other thing that I was wanting to point out as well is that even as we go towards this expansionist view of the doctrine, as time goes on, very, very different from just the plain words that we read from Monroe at the start of the stream. Even as we go towards there, we are still explicitly limited towards defense. Even though we're throwing around ideas of total modalization, of total force being used upon European powers or whatever else, the explicit limiting principle is still like direct invasion. Monroe meant direct invasion applied towards a republic that would affect us. Polk extended that to our sphere of influence as he tended to view it. Now it's towards just any part of the Western Hemisphere we would meet with direct force as a general resolution, according to Olney. But it's still a direct defensive action. That's a very important limiting principle. We could complain in America all day about growing influence, increasing trade with people that aren't the United States or whatever else, potentially hostile governments towards us, but that's still not an attack on us. So this limiting principle is very hard to overstate.
Yes, well, speaking of limiting principles, we're about to throw those out the window as we're going to move on now to President Theodore Roosevelt's address to Congress in December 6, 1904, so roughly 10 years later. Now, one of the things we're doing on this show, if people have not realized that, is sort of disabuse you of these meme notions people have about our own history, and actually get to the root of what our history actually is and what these people actually believed. Now, of course, Theodore Roosevelt is kind of a meme in our spheres, and I'm not saying you have to dislike Roosevelt, but he certainly laid waste to the Monroe Doctrine, and definitely brought us into a different era of projecting global power on what you might say these moral crusades. So I will start at the very beginning of his speech. Quote, in treating of our foreign policy and of the attitude that this great nation should assume in the world at large, it is absolutely necessary to consider the Army and Navy, and the Congress, through which the thought of the nation finds its expression, should keep ever vividly in mind the fundamental fact that it is impossible to treat our foreign policy, whether this policy takes shape in the effort to secure justice for others or justice for ourselves, save as conditioned upon the attitude we are willing to take toward our Army and especially toward our Navy. It is not merely unwise, it is contemptible for a nation, as for an individual, to use high-sounding language to proclaim its purposes, or take positions which are ridiculous if unsupported by potential force, and then to refuse to provide this force. If there is no intention of providing and keeping the force necessary to back up a strong attitude, then it is far better to not assume such an attitude. The steady aim of this nation, as of all enlightened nations should be to strive to bring ever nearer the day when there shall prevail throughout the world the peace of justice. End quote.
I mean, that lines up with what we've read so far, right? Our purpose is to bring justice to the world.
Well, I mean, you say that, Ryan, but at least the first part of what he said does line up. He's basically making the mirror image of the Calhoun argument. You know, Calhoun says we don't have strength, so we shouldn't make grand proclamations, whereas Roosevelt is saying, well, of course we have to make grand proclamations, so we damn well better build up the strength.
Right, yes.
Yes, exactly. So he's sort of smuggling in the need for this large standing army and a navy by saying, well, we're going to make these proclamations, so we need them. Interesting there too, this idea that we're going to seek justice for others in the world, and now we're talking about justice in the entire world. I'm going to skip forward a little bit. I don't know if you guys want to read anything else, but I'll just quote one sentence from a later paragraph. Quote, "We are in every way endeavoring to help on, with cordial goodwill, every movement which will tend to bring us into more friendly relations with the rest of mankind." End quote. So, I mean, that right there is, as we said, that's clearly what we were just reading this whole time, right? It's like the Monroe Doctrine is about backing literally everything that makes the entire rest of mankind friendlier to us. Yeah, I'm thinking this is a little bit different. I don't know about you guys.
Well, and I don't think we should read this because it's going to be very long-winded, if you will, but he's going on trying to explain what he means by peace and goodwill and all this other stuff, and those are very loaded terms to Roosevelt and not the very direct and earthy understandings that our previous statesmen had. Because to Roosevelt, peace means like a complete freedom from all tyranny, injustice, and any sort of cowardice. Like, this is a very wide-reaching and metaphysical concept that doesn't just refer to a state of peace between nations, say, or a life under a well-functioning government. So before he gets to this point where he's talking about goodwill, peace, and whatnot else, he's already loaded the terms with so many implications that it would,
Yes.
like, you could put every resource in man in America towards achieving this, and we would never get there, and we would run out of both before we got towards it.
Yes, Roosevelt abjures, quote, "the peace of tyrannous terror, the peace of craven weakness, the peace of injustice. All these should be shunned as we shun unjust, unrighteous war. The goal set before us as a nation, the goal which should be set before all mankind, is the attainment of the peace of justice, of the peace that comes when each nation is not merely safeguarded in its own rights, but scrupulously recognizes and performs its duty towards others."
Yes, peace is when your big army and navy makes everyone peaceful. All right, I will read basically the rest of the speech after that sentence I read, starting at the next paragraph. So just stop me if you want to stop, otherwise I'll just finish the speech off. Quote, "It is not true that the United States feels any land hunger or entertains any projects as regards to the other nations of the Western Hemisphere, save such as are for their welfare. All that this country desires is to see the neighboring countries stable, orderly, and prosperous. Any country whose people conduct themselves well, we can count upon our hearty friendship. If a nation shows that it knows how to act with reasonable efficiency and decency in social and political matters, if it keeps order and pays its obligation, it need fear no interference from the United States. Chronic
So let's stop
wrongdoing."
there and comment on the unspoken. So if a nation is decent, if a nation is efficient, if a nation pays its obligations, then you have nothing to fear. Don't worry about it. But what's the other half of that proposition that he doesn't say?
Well, he says it right here. Chronic wrongdoing or an impotence which results in a general loosening of the ties of a civilized society may in America, as elsewhere, ultimately require intervention by some civilized nation, and in the Western Hemisphere, the adherence of the United States to the Monroe Doctrine may force the United States, however reluctantly, in flagrant cases of such wrongdoing or impotence, to the exercise of an international police power.
Yeah, so we've completely thrown out the idea of the Monroe Doctrine as being directed against European intervention, the idea of the Monroe Doctrine, even of being directed against outside intervention generally. Now it's like, if you don't police your internal affairs to our liking, then we are going to step in.
Yeah, well,
this is just to make this slightly fairer, though I don't think that people should just take it at this level, because very clearly this has been used beyond what I'm about to say. The context by which Theodore Roosevelt is saying all of this is that European countries were threatening to intervene in Latin America because they wouldn't repay their debts. And so Theodore Roosevelt's solution to this ongoing crisis was to just say the United States will do that for Europe just free of charge because we have the Monroe Doctrine. So it's contradicting the Monroe Doctrine, it's reinterpreting it to fit this crisis. But the fact that we can read this without needing the context of that debt repayment crisis to understand what he's saying here, I think speaks for itself. This is not just limited to repayment of debts.
Yes, and of course, I mean, he cites the Monroe Doctrine as, you know, we're adhering to the Monroe Doctrine, and then explicitly says something that is absolutely not in the doctrine. So yeah, I mean, there are practical considerations to consider. Of course, we're not trying to be ideologues or make you hate Theodore Roosevelt or something, but this is not the Monroe Doctrine. This idea that we're going to interfere in the internal politics of any state in the hemisphere to our liking, that is absolutely not part of the Monroe Doctrine, and it hasn't even been in the doctrine in terms of its growth up until this point, even 10 years before, as we saw Olney describe. Even though there was a little germ of that there, it certainly was not at this level.
And I mean, just look at this. This idea of international police power was nowhere in any of the discussions that we've talked about to this point. This is just a pure insertion.
Now, continuing, quote, if every country washed by the Caribbean Sea would show the progress in stable and just civilization, which with the aid of the Platt Amendment Cuba has shown since our troops left the island, and which so many republics in both Americas are constantly and brilliantly showing, all question of interference by this nation with their affairs would be at an end. Our interests and those of our southern neighbors are really identical. They have great natural riches, and within their borders the reign of law and justice obtains, prosperity is sure to come to them. While they thus obey the primary laws of civilized society, they may rest assured that they will be treated by us in a spirit of cordial and helpful sympathy. We would interfere with them only in the last resort, and then only if it became evident that the inability or unwillingness to do justice at home and abroad had violated the rights of the United States or had invited foreign aggression to the detriment of the entire body of American nations. It is a mere truism to say that every nation, whether in America or anywhere else, which desires to maintain its freedom, its independence, must ultimately recognize the right of such independence cannot be separated from the responsibility of making good use of it.
Yeah, so look at this here. The Monroe Doctrine is no longer for the American Republic as it relates to Europe and the Americas. It's for the entire body of American nations.
And it's also tied to the use of natural resources, right? It's not just, oh, you need to have a republican form of government and be independent from Europe. It's that you'd better have a government that makes good use of the resources on your continent, on your part of the continent, for the betterment of everyone else on the continent. You know, it's your duty to self-govern in a way that exploits the natural resources the way America wants you to exploit them.
Right, and the other thing that's very interesting as well is this is where we get the first insertion of foreign influence. Everything up until this point had been a direct, if Europe directly invades a country to reestablish a colonial government, the United States would find that to be hostile or potentially meet it with arms, depending on later interpretations. Now it's just, if you invite foreign aggression, whatever that means, then the Monroe Doctrine gets invoked on behalf of the entire Americas. Mr. Quinn, it looked like you were wanting to say something.
You've already covered it.
Cool.
All right, and now I will read the final paragraph in this speech. Quote, in asserting the Monroe Doctrine, in taking such steps as we have taken in regard to Cuba, Venezuela, and Panama, and endeavoring to
Cuba, Venezuela, and Panama. Amazing how nothing changes.
And in endeavoring to circumscribe the theater of war in the Far East and to secure the open door in China, we have acted in our own interest as well as in the interest of humanity at large. There are, however, cases in which, while our own interests are not greatly involved, strong appeal is made to our sympathies. Ordinarily, it is very much wiser and more useful for us to concern ourselves with striving for our own moral and material betterment here at home than to concern ourselves with trying to better the condition of things in other nations. We have plenty of sins of our own to war against, and under ordinary circumstances we can do more for the general uplifting of humanity by striving with heart and soul to put a stop to civic corruption, to brutal lawlessness and violent race prejudices here at home than by passing resolutions and wrongdoing elsewhere. Nevertheless, there are occasional crimes committed on so vast a scale and of such peculiar horror as to make us doubt whether it is not our manifest duty to endeavor at least to show our disapproval of the deed and our sympathy with those who have suffered by it.
They're gassing their own people.
Yeah, that's a really interesting phrasing he uses there. Just showing our disapproval and our sympathy when he's he's talking about going to war. It's a very subversive way of shoehorning these ideas in this moral language. Continuing.
The other,
Yeah,
just
no,
before
go
we
ahead.
continue as well, just because we've sort of read the very relevant parts to the point I'm about to make, this is why when people are very afraid of including sort of these ethereal and undefined terms as a course for action, this is why they're always afraid of doing so. Because Polk included this idea of national interest into the Monroe Doctrine, which was clearly not the point of Monroe's doctrine when he originally said it, and it doesn't appear as much as other phrases do that are more tangible. Because now that we've included this idea of the national interest, here we have like a great statesman of the 20th century by at least most mainstream standards saying that the national interest also applies to like if another nation with their own people does something of so great a moral injustice that it's within our national interest to stop them because we're just so offended by it. Like there's nothing in the idea of a national interest for this not to be a case. We can argue all day as to whether it really is our national interest, but it's not against the term. It's up for debate. So it's this very clearly, and once again with the historical evidence as to how this has been applied, seems to be a major win in spirit for the Calhoun types that were against this ethereal phrasing and these very vague statements that we back up with force.
Yeah, and note how he's sort of affirming that ordinarily we wouldn't intervene in any other nation's internal affairs, but they might do something so bad, like violent race prejudices or something, that we would just have to, based on our own moral spirit and character, we would simply have to go to war. I mean, think about this at the beginning of the 20th century and then the rest of the 20th century and where this leads. I will continue. Quote, where was I? Yes. Quote, the cases must be extreme in which such a course is justifiable. There must be no effort made to remove the mote from our brother's eye if we refuse to remove the beam from our own. But in extreme cases, action may be justifiable and proper. What form the action shall take must depend upon the circumstances of the case, that is, upon the degree of the atrocity and upon our power to remedy it. The cases in which we could interfere by force of arms, as we interfered to put a stop to the intolerable conditions in Cuba, are necessarily very few. Yet it is not to be expected that a people like ours, which in spite of certain very obvious shortcomings, nevertheless, as a whole, shows by its consistent practice in its beliefs in the principles of civil and religious liberty, and in orderly freedom, a people among whom even the worst crime, like the crime of lynching, is never more than a sporadic, so that individuals and not classes are molested in their fundamental rights. It is inevitable that such a nation should desire eagerly to give expression to its horror on occasion, like that of the massacre of the Jews in Kishinev, or when it witnesses such systemic and long extended cruelty and oppression as the cruelty and oppression of which the Armenians have been the victims, and in which have won for them the indignant pity of the entire world, the civilized world. End quote. So yeah, that second half, I mean, you can basically extrapolate all of America's 20th century foreign policy, um, and also domestic policy from all of that, all the horrible stuff. I mean, based Teddy Roosevelt, am I right? We have to make sure, uh, that we remedy atrocities in other countries, particularly ones that, have to do with what were the words he used? The horrendous crime of lynching, or
Violent racial prejudice.
yes,
Yes, horror, like the massacre of the Jews.
yes, and the
Could you
molestation of classes. But yeah, the
could you
massacre of the
imagine if the
Jews.
United States imagine if the United States had to spend like hundreds of thousands of men, millions of dollars, completely upend like our political system that every is
Or we're still live.
sort of on a more meta level.
You guys double check for me too.
I think that what we've seen,
if you please.
especially the last
Ryan,
four or so years.
we've dropped.
No,
Okay,
no,
I think
we're still live.
Okay, are we still here?
Yes, hopefully
right.
your quips
So
there
this
were
is
caught
something
because
that I think is very important. Over the last 4 or 5 years, the American right, especially online, probably got so tired of being maligned by Europeans, Canadians, Asians, and Africans that started to look back to our own history of presidents that are usually considered bad for those people. And we noticed that Teddy Roosevelt is almost universally disliked by most of those places. And we noticed that Teddy Roosevelt actively did very big things and spoke a lot about grandiose political maneuvers, used American force, threw our weight around. And we decided that we just need to unquestionably accept Teddy Roosevelt as being a good expression of America. But you can sort of see his ahistoricity here. And I think that on something as vital as foreign policy, this should be cause for more revisionism surrounding Teddy Roosevelt, at least by Americans. I don't trust many of the other groups to do this correctly. But we don't just have to accept him because he like looks vital or he did things. Like that's a bad reason to just unquestioningly accept him.
absolutely. You guys can hear me, right?
Yes, we hear
Okay.
you.
Yeah, so absolutely. And that's where I was going about the meme interpretation. It's like, oh yes, I mean, okay, yes, Teddy Roosevelt created the national parks. Also, he like looks cool and hunts and does cool stuff. Wow, that's super based, and we should really be into this guy. We it's very important we utterly eradicate this view of history and our historical figures from our minds and the minds of everyone listening. You need to go out and utterly destroy this type of mimetic history being done. If if you have not taken that away from this podcast at this point, I don't know what to tell you, but I am telling it to you right now. Okay, we're not saying you must hate and despise Theodore Roosevelt or something, but there does need to be significant revisionism across the board, in many cases on our history, particularly these figures like Teddy Roosevelt, who are just sort of put on a pedestal for basically no reason, like for just a couple of like minor historical facts people know about him, rather than like what actually happened. Like I said, we're not going to blame like the 20th century on Teddy Roosevelt or something, but you can extrapolate everything we hate about American foreign and domestic policy in the 20th century from the end of this speech right here. It's all right there. It's very plainly put in very, what we would say, progressive or, liberal terms.
Absolutely. It can't be emphasized enough. We at American Spirits are going through American history. We're demythologizing it, and we're adding the correctives where court history has obscured the truth.
And also something on the line of rejecting this meme history is that a lot of the justifications you get for how good this ideology is very much mimetic. There's not really much primary source substance behind it. You don't, just because Europeans hate you and blame everything that has been done in the name of American foreign policy on you in particular, does not mean that you have to run to very ill-considered ideas from the 20th century just because they sound based. Similarly, you don't have to just order your thoughts about American history around what sounds the most based. You can just analyze the history and make conclusions in light of what's happened. It is all right. You do not suddenly turn into an America-hating dissident if you reject, say, the progressive era's foreign policy. Like, you can do that and not hate your country. It's possible.
Very well put. In conclusion, we're right at the 90-minute mark. Isn't that beautiful? So I think it's time to get to the super chats. We have a number of them. So first off, actually, I have one that we missed out of Entropy like 2 or 3 streams ago from the Shadow Band for $15. He sends a salute. Thank you, Mr. The Shadow Band, for that. I can now delete this screenshot off my desktop. I believe I forgot to turn on Entropy. I had some audio issues I wanted to make sure were solved, but that's okay. We have a couple on YouTube itself for me to read through. So, in addition, from that $15 that the Shadow Band had sent, we have Dawn Browning sends us, of course, the 10 Australian dollars with like a pair with like a headband. I guess it's like a ninja, like bowing, and it says thank you. I think it's a pair, yeah. So thank you, Dawn Browning, for the continued memes and support of the show.
As ever, Miss Browning.
And we've also got Bolero 393 for $10. This is just to celebrate James K. Polk's epic presidency.
Epic it certainly was.
And then Bolero 393 again for $10. It is ironic that the antebellum Southerners coveted Cuba, but it took William McKinley to authorize its invasion. Thank you, Bolero 393, for your donations. Finally, Alexander Hale for $19.99. Keep doing what you do, Patriots. Thank you for the lessons. I will like that.
Thank you for the super chat, Patriot.
Yes, thank you very much for listening. Spread far and wide. I had the picture of Trump and Vance as Master Chief and Cortana open accidentally. So yeah, it was just like right in my face on my giant TV as I looked up. Anyway, yeah, thank you everyone for listening. And like, this is the start of a new series. You know, we have a couple of series we've done so far on this show. This is the Monroe Doctrine arc, which we're going to be ending around Christmas time. So definitely get people to watch this stream, share it, because it's going to be relevant to everything we do for the next couple of weeks. So now's the time to get caught up if you're behind.
And I mean, definitely rewatch last week's stream if you weren't able to listen in.
Yeah, perhaps I should do that because I didn't watch last week's stream. But yes, in fact, I did a speed run of the Monroe Doctrine just because I've been so busy getting back home and everything. But I think this turned out really well. I'm very happy with the stream. Hopefully, everyone enjoyed it. Thank you too for joining as well as ever. So with that, unless anyone has any closing thoughts, we will see you next week. What are we? I forgot. What are we doing next week?
Let me find out.
Yes, we do like to announce that the schedule got bumped a little bit because of the trip I went on, but I know we have the whole thing planned out. Let's see if I can find it right here. I know we have our friend George Bagby coming on.
Yes, we will be covering William Graham Sumner's speech after the Spanish-American War called "The Conquest of the United States by Spain."
Excellent.
So, if that title and
and Bagby's on for that one, right?
Yes.
Yes.
That means I get the week off. Excellent.
Yeah, if you want
The audience can dine on the real article rather than great value, George Bagby.
Yeah, so cool. Yeah, that really came up quickly, so it'll be fun to have him on. I know he's very well liked as a guest. So, again, thank you everyone for watching. Thank you too, and look forward to that next week.